Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is my Forbes colleague, money and politics reporter, Kyle Khan-Mullins. Kyle, thanks so much for coming back on.
Always great to be here, Brittany. Thanks for having me.
You have some reporting on Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent's fortune, and as we know, he really hit the ground running in the past few months once he was confirmed into Trump's cabinet. He's defending and has been the public face of President Trump's tariffs. He's been talking about them in the media amidst this global trade war. So, can you recap the last few really chaotic months of his tenure as Treasury Secretary?
Absolutely. President Trump came into office saying he was going to reshape global trade, and boy, has he tried. We've seen tariffs on, tariffs off but all across the world. We've seen rates up, rates down. At one point, I want to say the tariffs on China reached, was it 145% at its peak? I don't remember exactly what it peaked at, but the numbers have been swinging wildly. Just today, or maybe it was yesterday, we got the news that Scott Bessent just got back from Switzerland, where he finished negotiating a framework for continuing negotiations with the Chinese over trade. They're framing that as a new trade deal with the Chinese. We'll see if that holds. But that seems to be that has been his role for the past couple of months. He came into office. He's running the nation's treasury, and he really, like you said, has been the public face of this global trade war and global economic reordering that we're watching. And he has been one of the president's chief defenders in the media, like you mentioned.
And you're reporting that he has always thrived working for big personalities. So it's not really a surprise based on what you wrote that he is working for President Trump. But how did he get into the president's orbit?
Yeah, as far as we can tell, all indications are he used to actually be a Democrat. In his early days in New York finance, he supported liberal causes. But as recently as 2016, we saw he donated $1 million inaugural fund. So clearly he made a more conservative turn at that point. And then he's been way up and been president ever since. In 2024, during that campaign, he was one of President Trump's chief economic advisors. He was also a big fundraiser, and the president rewarded that loyalty with a cabinet position, one of the most important cabinet positions, I might add, in 2025 when he appointed to Secretary of the Treasury.
And so now, as Treasury Secretary, he's making a nice salary of well over $200,000, a six-figure salary. But based on your reporting, he doesn't really need the paycheck. How much is Forbes reporting that and estimating that Scott Bessent is worth?
He doesn't seem to need the paycheck. We're estimating he's worth about $600 million. There are some error bars on that. We're going to talk about that a little bit. There's some uncertainty in that calculation, but that's our estimate, is that he's worth about $600 million.
So let's talk about how he got there because that is a nice chunk of change. He was a Wall Street guy for decades, but what did his early life look like? Because he did come from somewhat humble beginnings.
Absolutely, yeah. He grew up in the South Carolina Low Country, coastal South Carolina. His dad was a real estate developer who made some bad bets. He says that his dad hit hard financial times pretty early on in Scott's life. And so Secretary Bessent, at the age of 9, was working already, putting up umbrellas and chairs at Myrtle Beach. That's what Senator Lindsey Graham was talking about at this confirmation hearing, telling stories about Bessent. Another story he told, that Bessent was voted most likely to succeed when he graduated from high school. Initially, he wanted to go to the Naval Academy, but the Naval Academy didn't admit gay men back then, and he didn't want to lie about his sexuality. And he still landed on his feet, though, ended up at Yale University. It wasn't such a bad break for him.
So, how does Scott Bessent go from slinging chairs and umbrellas on the beach to working in finance?
Yeah, apparently in the middle there was actually a brief stint in journalism. He tried out at the student paper at Yale, but after he tried to become the editor and that bid failed, he decided to pivot to a significantly more well-compensated career, which is finance. A Yale alum, Jim Rogers, was looking for an intern, and he found that intern in Scott Bessent. He also offered Bessent a place to sleep in New York, a couch in the office. Bessent said that was critical for him in making the decision. And that started off a long and lucrative career on Wall Street.
And I want to dive into that career, but before we do, Republicans have long criticized someone named George Soros. He has really been in Republicans' crosshairs for at least a decade now. And it's interesting because a top Trump cabinet official, Scott Bessent, worked with him for decades. So, talk to us a little bit about that working relationship.
Yeah, it seems like that initial job with Rogers eventually led him to a even more important and lucrative job with George Soros. Rogers and Soros, they were initial co-partners in investment together. Rogers ended up retiring quite early in his 30s. Soros kept on investing, and he's still investing today. But Bessent ended up going to work for Soros next. In 1991, he went to work for Soros's international investment firm. He worked in the London office, where he was involved in 1992 in the big bet that made Soros globally famous when he tanked the British pound. He bet against the British pound, which was pegged to artificially high versus the Deutsche Mark. And because of that, Bessent and Soros made a ton of money. Soros became, by Forbes' estimation, the first person to ever make $1 billion in just 1 month when eventually the pound collapsed and Soros's firm, which had shorted it, made lots of money.
I mean, that's just an eye popping number, $1 billion in 1 month. So then Scott Bessent eventually goes out on his own. He starts his own hedge fund. Talk to us about that. How successful was that firm?
Yeah, he worked for Soros for about 8 more years, and then in 2000 went and started his own Bessent Capital. He had about $200 million in backing from his old boss, George Soros. But it didn't seem to go super well. We don't know all the details. He talks in one interview a couple years back that he should have taken less advice from his investors and should have just gone with his gut a little bit more. But at any rate, it didn't work out super well, and the hedge fund ended up closing around 2005 or so.
So then during that time, about 20 years ago, what does he do next?
He tried a couple different things. He went to work for another hedge fund, some other money management businesses. He also taught economic history at Yale, headed back to campus for a little bit. He got married in 2011 to his husband, now husband, and the two of them have 2 kids together today. And then in 2011, he went back to his old boss. George Soros at that point had converted his investment firm into a family office, and he appointed as his chief investment officer. And over the next couple of years, Bessent reportedly made Soros $10 billion in additional profit. So he ended up working with, whatever happened at his own firms, he was doing really, really well with for Soros, and Soros was doing quite well as well.
So then maybe that gave him the confidence to start another hedge fund despite the first failed firm. What did that look like, Keysquare? Tell us about that venture, and was it as unsuccessful as the first go round?
So in 2015, he started a second hedge fund, Keysquare. Again, he had backing from Soros, temporary backing of $2 billion. That was about 40% of the peak of Keysquare's assets under management. It peaked at about $5 billion in, I think, 2018, if I'm remembering correctly. And he had a really good first year. In 2016, Keysquare bet that Britain would vote to leave the European Union and that the British pound would once again drop. They were right about that, and they made quite a bit of money. They outpaced the S&P 500 in that year. But then the next couple of years were kind of unsteady. They either lost value or relatively flat. We can see their returns in public reports from the New York Police Department's pension fund, which was invested in Keysquare. See that Keysquare didn't have fantastic years in the between 2017 and 2021 or so. So the money started drying up. Soros pulled out his capital per a prearranged agreement, but it seems like even more money started leaving along with Soros's. They had a really good year in 2022. They bet there was going to be higher inflation in the United States than markets were expecting, and they were again correct about that. They had a fantastic year in 2022, but it wasn't to attract investors back. And ultimately, the fund seems to have been just continuously wound down since then. It only had about $500 million in assets under management as of June of last year, 2024. And according to Bessent's disclosures today, the fund has been essentially terminated.
So now let's set our sights on his other assets. Let's start with real estate, because you're reporting in the past 30 years or so, he's owned over a dozen properties. Can you talk to us about them?
Yeah, the Wall Street Journal actually had a really good report on this. He has owned over 20 properties over his lifetime. It's a really wide array of different real estate reporting, or excuse me, real estate holdings. He's got home. He has had at times homes all over the world, in the Bahamas, in London, in the Carolinas, in North Dakota, really just spanning the breadth in New York. And he hasn't been afraid to lose money on those. Just a couple of years ago, he bought, he was living in New York at the time. Then he sold a New York apartment. He lost millions on that New York apartment. It didn't seem to bother him all that much. Again, when you're worth $600 million, which he has built over this enormously successful career at times in hedge funding and money management, a couple $1 million here or there, probably not going to break the bank. Another thing that I think I find interesting, at least, is in Charleston, South Carolina. He has been really engaged in historical preservation of some really beautiful old properties. He's got a commercial property down there that he still owns. He just sold a really big estate. You might have seen pictures of it, but it was which really made it stick out among these old Southern homes. That was another piece of his real estate was historical preservation.
And so, as you and I sit here today, what does his real estate portfolio look like now?
So some of his more recent purchases, he sold off most of those homes that I'm talking about. But some of his more recent purchases include a place in Cashiers, North Carolina. That's in rural North Carolina. And that was in 2022. And then he just in DC to become the Secretary of the Treasury. He currently lives in a $12.5 million Georgia neighborhood estate. He's got a pool. He's got a backyard garden, living quite comfortably in his new job.
And earlier this year, after President Trump nominated him to serve in his cabinet and before his Senate confirmation hearing, Scott Bessent released financial disclosure forms. When you're parsing through those, what are some of your takeaways? What details stuck out to you?
Yeah, a couple of things here. I mentioned earlier there's a little bit of uncertainty. There's some error bars around that $600 million number. The reason for that is because these financial disclosure forms are limited in what they can tell us, right? And so just based on the financial disclosures alone, he has 9 assets that are in the largest category on the financial disclosures, which are it's simply listed as worth over $50 million. That doesn't really tell us that much. That could be infinite. Now, we don't think they're infinite. We have reasons to believe that his net worth is a little bit lower. But he also reported at least one liability, a margin account that was worth over $50 million. So could his net worth theoretically be negative infinite? Yes. Again, we don't think that's the case. We don't think that's a reasonable assumption to make. But the other thing that jumped out at me, some of the investments that he was invested in, and remember this disclosure was filed in December, so this is before he became the Secretary of the Treasury. He was still locked in on lots of big macroeconomic bets. In particular, he had what jumped out at me. He had some ETFs that were focused on the S&P 500. Okay, pretty normal for an investor trying to balance their fortune. But he also had some big bets on foreign currencies. He had some open positions on the European euro, the Japanese yen, and the Chinese yuan, and some really major holdings of U.S. Treasuries. Now, initially, his folks didn't comment for the story, but after I published the story, they reached out to confirm that he had in fact sold off all of those currency positions before he became the Secretary of the Treasury, which makes sense. That would have been a conflict of interest for him. So long story short, there's some uncertainty about his fortune, but we're pretty sure we've got it in the ballpark at least here at about 600 million. And he was, like I said, still a guy locked in on those big macroeconomic bets up until he became Secretary of the Treasury.
Well, Kyle, per usual, I appreciate our conversations and your reporting. Thanks for joining me.
Always good to be here, Brittany. Thanks again.